In this lesson, you're going to learn the who, what, where, when, and how of how people work. Why is this important? This is important because we want to understand how people work and the context in which they work so that we can design meaningful experiences that are accessible to the most number of people. So there's a couple things to understand about understanding people. One is they can work individually or they can work in groups. And then a second is that they often do sequences of actions. So they may be brushing their teeth and smiling at the same time. They may be talking on the phone and writing at the same time. All design experiences involve two things. The first one is people, and the second one is sequences of events. Let me give you a case study to illustrate how design experiences involve people and sequences. Consider the following case study. This was based on a project on which I was working. We were trying to redesign the refueling experience at the gasoline pump. It's an experience that we do very often, and we probably don't think a lot about, and we actually probably don't enjoy that much. That's precisely why we were trying to redesign the experience. To understand how people pump gas, we followed a technique called the ride-along. I sat in the back of Nick's car here with a camera in my hands and observed all the activities he did to pump gas at the gas station. But it wasn't just me and Nick. Right next to me was his 3-month-old daughter, who was getting a little fussy and wasn't quite sure she was ready for this errand. So we got to the gas station, and there Nick was, pumping gas. But he couldn't just pump gas and think about anything. Simultaneously, he was trying to entertain his daughter, who was getting more and more fussy. This is a great example about thinking about how people are often engaged with each other while interacting with an experience. So in the case of Nick, he wasn't just pumping alone, he was also trying to entertain his daughter. While entertaining his daughter, Nick had to go through a sequence of events while pumping gas. He first had to turn off the car. Then he had to pay into the system. He had to figure out, did he want to use a credit card or pay inside, as the little sticky note on there instructed. He would have to go inside if he wanted to pay with cash. He then had to type in his zip code into the screen. And then he was able to start pumping gas. Oh, but wait, first, he dropped the lid to the gasoline container. Haven't we all done that a million times? But is it designed for that experience? No. So after he picks up the lid, he puts it back on. And because he knows he's going to be picking up his daughter shortly, he puts some hand sanitizer on his hands. Again, notice the sequence of events. So pumping gas is not as simple as paying and putting the gas pump into the car for Nick. There's a whole other series of events that happen simultaneously. It was critical for us to understand all these bits and pieces, to understand and really think carefully, how could we make this experience easier for Nick? Here he is with his daughter, who finally at the end was done with it. Now Nick thought he was going to go on and do grocery shopping and do the dry cleaning, but his daughter had had enough. So that was the end of that errand. It was a total of 10 minutes of his time, and that was the work he got done on Saturday. He drove away. So what have we learned by this? From looking at this and going on this ride along, we can learn that it's not enough just to think about what it means to pump gas. You often have to follow in people's footsteps and see all the different processes and steps they go through and the challenges they face in doing it what seems like a very simple task. We thought refueling gas was easy. Not quite so for Nick. So why do we do design research? Well, let's think of it this way. Here's a street in my town. There's 2 banks on this town. They both hold my money and will keep it securely. But when I go into one bank, they remember my name and they know how much I like to take out on a weekly basis. Whereas I go into the other bank, they don't know who I am. One bank provides me a meaningful experience, whereas the other one, I'm just another number. Technically, they both provide the same experience, but I prefer one over the other. A second reason we do design research is because we want to make experiences more accessible to everyone. One of these banks, there's an automatic door that opens up when I'm going in with my stroller, so I don't have to hold the door and navigate in. The other bank, I always have to find somebody to help or awkwardly open the door and try and move my way in. Well, one bank has made it easier for me to access its services than the other. So 2 reasons for doing design research. One is create more meaningful experiences, and second is to make them more accessible to more people. Once you've decided you want to do design research, the first important thing is to come up with a plan. Now, I don't know about you, but I like to just run out there and see what's going on. But I find if I get out there and I'm not prepared with a list of questions, I often miss a lot. So I sit back down and I write down all the questions I possibly have. Now, often when I start a project, I'll have a fair amount of information, but there's many questions I don't know. So first, you're going to want to generate a list of questions. Remember how we started this lesson with the who, what, where, when, and how? You're going to want to start with those questions. Don't worry right now about being repetitive with your questions. We can weed those out later. Get them all down on paper. The very first question you're going to want to start with is the who. Who are the people involved? There's a number of people involved in any one system, as we learned from that initial case study of Nick refueling his car with gasoline. When we think about the people involved, we want to think about both the people who are directly involved as well as indirectly involved. Let's consider a case study from when I was working in the toy industry. I was working on a toy for 5 to 10-year-old boys. So we first started, before we began our research, we started thinking, who are all the people involved in this? Well, at the center were kids, of course. Who are kids connected to? They're connected to parents. Well, kids don't like to play alone. They often like to play with friends. Who else could we be missing? Kids interact with teachers every day. They might have something to say about this toy. Oh, and of course the people who sell the toy. Let's call them the store owners. That's good for now. Considering this group of people, the next thing we want to think about is, what is the relationship between these? Well, let's see. Parents often provide for kids. Friends often play with kids. Store owners want to sell to kids. And teachers want, well, to teach to kids. Now that we understand the ecosystem of who might be involved in this and the relationships between them, we can start to create a set of research questions, testing out these different relationships and understanding how they'll relate to the new experience that we're going to design. As we're preparing our research questions, we're going to want to think about each one of those stakeholders. So we're going to think, what are the kids' needs, wants, and desires? What are the parents' needs, wants, and desires? The teachers, the store owners, the toy manufacturers? We're going to want to think through each of those. If we just think about one stakeholder exclusively, we may miss an opportunity for redesign and an opportunity to create meaning for the vast majority of the stakeholders. After we've considered the relationship between the stakeholders, we then want to take a deeper look at each individual stakeholder and think about what are their needs, wants, and desires. So when kids are playing with toys, what do they need and want to do? What else could they be doing? When parents see their kids playing with toys, what are they needing and wanting to be doing? Parents may be wanting to make dinner while kids are playing with toys. Is there a way to design a toy that satisfies both the needs of the parents and the needs of the kids? The next thing we'll want to do is think about what are competitive products. Competitive products are alternatives that the kids could be doing, in this case, if they weren't playing with the toy. They could be reading a book, watching a movie, perhaps playing around outside. We'll want to think about what are all the other experiences that they could be doing, again, to understand the context in which play occurs for these children. Hopefully this has given you some ideas about how to generate a large list of questions. Next, what you will want to do before you go into the research field is lay out clearly what all your assumptions are about the group you're going to observe. Why do we want to lay out assumptions? We want to do this because if you're not clear with yourself about what your assumptions are, you may fail to see something that's quite obvious. Let me give you a case study. This was a story that comes from when I was working to redesign the interface of a train ticket purchasing application. And my assumption was, to get on the train, you need to purchase a ticket. Seems like a reasonable assumption to me. Well, I was trying to purchase the ticket, but as I was trying to purchase the ticket, unsuccessfully, mind you, the train was coming down the track. Well, I didn't have a lot of time. I wanted to get on the train, and so I said, well, let's see what happens if I don't purchase a ticket. So I jump on the train, and I ride for a 40-minute ride up to the city. And as I'm on the train, I'm thinking, looking around, seeing a bunch of signs that say, if you don't have a ticket, you will be fined. I didn't have a ticket and nobody was fining me. So I went up to the conductor and I asked the conductor, "Sir, what happens if I don't have a ticket?" And he told me with a very serious face, "You will be severely fined." I thanked him for answering my question and went and took a seat back down. Now this was interesting to me. He never asked me if I had a ticket, which I didn't, but I wasn't severely fined. So clearly an assumption that I had and many others have is that you need a ticket to ride this train. Well, I wasn't able to work the machine in time, so I rode the train anyway. That's something that I couldn't have learned without actually having gone out. I would have always assumed that you needed a ticket to ride the train. Now that you have your research questions set, it's time to pick the research method that will fit best with the question you need to answer. This is a very exciting part for me. There's hundreds of research methods that you could choose from. Today in this lesson, I'm just going to cover 3. I'm going to start with the one that I like to do at the start of every research project. It's called Safari. The reason we call it Safari is it's meant to suggest that you're going to an exotic place that you've never been before. Well, here's an example of a safari I want to share with you. Perhaps some of you have gone on this safari before. This is my safari to go get a cup of coffee at the McDonald's drive-thru. When I started this safari, I wanted to approach it as if I had never been to McDonald's before and never ordered a coffee. So the very first thing I had to do is figure out where the store was. I was able to identify it by these golden arches and a sign that said drive-thru. I pulled my car over to the side of the road and I approached the driveway. As I approached, I saw a menu in front of me. It was quite confusing to a person who had never seen it before. Again, I was trying to imagine, what if I had never seen this before? So many options, and all I wanted was a simple coffee. There was also a glare, you'll notice, on the screen, so it made it especially hard to see what all my options were. Next, I saw a prepare to order sign. I then pulled forward, and I saw a small box that said, confirm order. A very garbled voice came out of the box. I think she said, "What's your order?" Guessing that was what she said, I said, "A coffee, please." She offered me a small or a large. I responded with a large, and then I believe she told me it would cost $1.35, but I wasn't quite sure. So I pulled around the corner, and at this point I had to wait behind a couple cars. I hadn't anticipated that I would have had to wait because I didn't see the cars ahead of me beforehand. As I was waiting, I searched through my coin purse to find what I thought was the amount that I owed. I pulled up to the sign. I paid, lifting up the money with the coins falling out of my hand to the window that was about a foot above me. The woman caught the coins just before they fell out of my hand. And in exchange, she handed me a scalding hot coffee with sugar and milk and a mix stick precariously perched on top. I pulled that down. As I'm pulling this down, she said, "Thank you," encouraging me to move on. Very carefully, I put the hot coffee into my drink container, restarted my car, and moved forward. That's a service safari to McDonald's. Again, something we think of as pretty simple, but when I went through each step and broke it down, it was actually quite complex to navigate. After I've done a safari, which helps me just understand the basic lay of the land, I then often transition to a research technique called observations. Observations are about looking all around you and really immersing yourself in an environment and seeing how different people interact. When you arrive for an observation, if it's a formal observation, you'll want to introduce yourself and explain to people why you're there. Be very clear to explain that you're there to watch how people are engaging. You're not evaluating them, but merely understanding how to make the experience better. Let me illustrate the observation technique from a recent project I did with a supermarket. We are trying to make the checkout experience easier. Here I am sitting at the end of the supermarket aisle for hours watching people come through. Now you may say to yourself, what could you possibly have seen in hours? Fascinating things. I learned that certain people are offered help out with their groceries and certain people are not. Some people like to talk with the grocers, others prefer not to talk with them. I learned that some people like to push multiple shopping carts out and others prefer not to. So multiple observations with without having been there, I couldn't have observed. While in the grocery store, I had a certain set of questions that I wanted to be sure to ask. I wanted to be sure to know, who are all the stakeholders? What is the language that's used between the service provider and the person purchasing their gifts? When does the interaction really succeed and go well? And when does it fail? It often failed, I observed, when the service provider, the checkout counter person, offered more services than the person wanted. Another question I asked was, how did they position their bodies? How did they position their hands? There's a lot to manage when you're going grocery shopping. I wanted to understand, how did they manage the groceries, the shopping cart, while working with the keyboard? Also during the observation, I was careful to do something that I call 360-degree observations. So while that initial photo I showed you was taken from the checkout counter, I made sure to move all around the store to get photos from all different angles. When you're doing an observation, you want to be sure to do what I call 360-degree observations. That is, taking photographs and making observations from every possible angle. Don't be afraid to go in the ask for permission to go in the back room to see how the shelves are stocked, or to go by where the groceries come into the supermarket. It's important to see all parts of the system to understand how they interact. The next thing you want to be sure to do when you're doing observations is look for workarounds. I love workarounds. Workarounds to me are clever ways that average people use to overcome some of the failures that we as designers make in the products. On the far left here, you'll see a girl who didn't have a hair rubber band, and instead of a hair rubber band, she stuck a pencil in her hair to keep it up and out of her face. The next picture is of a woman I observed at church last Sunday. She didn't have a place to put her jacket. It was a hot day, and so she put it over the back of her wheelchair so as to keep her coat from not wrinkling and her lap from not getting too hot from the jacket. This was not the intended design of the wheelchair design, but yet it worked very well for her. The last one is an interesting one. With the proliferation of smartphones, so much is going digital, and yet I find that people struggle to often quick notes of things they need to remember. Here's a case where a person put a piece of sticky tape on the outside of their phone case and wrote a note of something they wanted to remember, rather than taking the time to digitally enter it into their phone. Also, while doing observations, you're going to really want to look at body language. Sometimes people will be saying one thing, but feeling another. So for example, when I do this, do I look happy? No, I'm frustrated, I'm angry. When I do this, am I happy? Yeah. People's hunched shoulders often means they're not happy. Crossed arms, usually closed-minded, not open-minded. So while you may see one person with their arms close and saying, yes, I want to hear your ideas, you want to trust your instincts in reading body language. That's often what people are feeling. Lastly, you're going to want to look for triggers for behavior. So this is to say, what are the things that cue people to do things a little differently? An obvious trigger that we've all experienced is a fire alarm. A fire alarm goes off, people often get up and leave the building. That's a very obvious trigger. A lot more triggers are even more subtle. When somebody enters the room, do people stand up? Do they stand up for everybody that enters the room? What are the subtle triggers that evoke a different behavior for people? Last, you may ask, what if I don't see anything? Well, I'm going to encourage you to take a new perspective. So, when you're done watching this video, here's what I'd like you to do. Get down on your knees, just like this. Pretend you're a 5-year-old. Look at the world around you. What do you see differently? Some things are easier to reach right in front of you. Other things are harder. You see the world in a whole new way. So if you're ever feeling like you're not seeing something interesting, take a new perspective. I guarantee you'll see something.